Hey guys, welcome back. To create the game you just saw using the Godot engine, though I imagine there are going to be features here which will be useful regardless of the engine you're using, we use a function called slurp. I am actually intending to submit this function in the not too distant future to Godot Core, but I must admit I have not actually personally submitted much to it yet, or really anything. I imagine it's going to be simple enough. But in the meanwhile, let me give you an explanation of it so you can implement it in, say, GD script or your language of choice and just hit the ground running. What it is spherical interpolation for non-planar node guidance. In this case, in the Godot game engine. And I'm going to give you a mathematical background on it, not just math expecting you to understand it, but basically explaining it in the plainest English I can manage. So let's get started. Usually when you're interpolating between two things, you're using what's called a linear interpolation, which won't really do the job here. But let's break down what that means exactly to understand why spherical, or slurping, works better. If you look into the etymology of interpolation, we have inter at the beginning, which is between, ation at the end, which is an action of, and then polare, which is Latin, effectively meaning alteration. It can also mean polish, but at that point it's just gibberish. So between, the act of altering between two states. So basically a mixing of two values. You give it one value, you give it another, a basis and a target, and the extent between the two, and it approximates that via an internal function. Now, I have problems with interpolation as a choice of name, but it is the one being used, and we happen to have a cool nickname for it, just lerping. You'll also hear it referred to as mixing. That has its own linguistic issues, but I'm going to try not to language nerd out on you. We're going to go with lerp because it sounds cool, basically. And it lets us say slurp, as opposed to smix, which I have all kinds of issues with. I like slurp. It's a fun word. So mathematical definition of linear interpolation. I remind you it's taking one point or color or whatever have you, something vector-like, and easing into a different state from it. You'll take two parameters here, v0 and v1, which are whatever the type is you're interpolating between, and t, which is usually bounded between 0 and 1. There are points where you'll want to go outside of that, which is called extrapolating, but we're not going to worry about that here. And the definition of it is the factor of 1 minus t times whatever your v0 is, plus t times whatever v1 is. Now remembering that t is always between 0 and 1, that's basically filling up one half of the fraction with v0 and the other half with v1. You take portions of the two, add them together, and they will always be on that line between the two. So v0 and v1 are your endpoints. They can be whatever you want as long as they're a vector or vector-like. They can be a scalar even. A color, it's usually a position, a speed, or a color in game programming, but really this applies to all kinds of things. And t is the bounded distance between them. So if t was outside of 0 to 1, you would see that you would be, say, if it's less than 0, you'd be heading further toward v0 than v0 is. You'd be overshooting it. Greater than 1, you're overshooting v1. And there are times for that, but we won't be worrying about them here. So why is it linear? This is interesting. The earliest equation of a line you are likely to have learned from school is y equals mx plus b. Now m would be a slope here, the rate at which y changes over a change in x. Get into calculus, it's dy over dx. B is the offset of it. also called the y-intercept when you're really young. So if x is equal to 0, then y is equal to b. Breaking down lerp, which I remind you is this, if we consider v0 to be the origin, m becomes v1. I know it's no longer just a normal number, but it's got the same effect. That is your slope. T would be x here, because we're interpolating between t equals 0 and t equals 1. You're going to have to squish it around in your head a little, but my point is, this is the same formula. These two are basically equivalent. One just describes what you're doing with it more than the other, and introduces what might be vectors instead. So it's still just a straight line, all over again. And it behaves graphically as a line. If you take a position and another position and you linearly interpolate something between them, you will see it move on a straight line between the two, which is usually quite handy, but therein lies our problem, why we need to bring spheres into this. A line's going to punch straight through the sphere. It's going to go from one point to the other, right through the middle of it. Its distance from the origin of the sphere is going to vary quite a bit as it goes. In fact, technically this drawing isn't even accurate because it's immediately going to punch through the surface of the sphere. What we need is something a little more nuanced than that. We want an arc along the two like this. To do that, instead of following the line, we have to follow the formula of the sphere itself so that every point is along the surface of that sphere. And if you're curious, yeah, you can do this with weirder shapes too, as long as you know the shape of that. It won't be a regular slurp and you'll have to write it yourself, but the principles are the same. Moving forward, what are we really interpolating between then? If not the positions themselves, what is it we're actually changing? Because we still want that gradual flow from one point to another. In this case, you need to start thinking outside of, your usual linear Cartesian space and start thinking in sphere space. Because there are two perpendicular axes in there, like x and y, phi and theta, which is the angle in one direction and the angle in the other. And of course, you've got r after that. I'm assuming it's just 1 throughout this, but it's not too hard to work another value in. So we kind of implement a lot of that here, and this is where the trigonometry comes in, but I'll try and explain that slowly to you. I know not everybody thinks trig is as fun as I do. I understand. Takes all kinds, so let me help you out. Now, if we just did the segment between the two with linear interpretation, that would be what's called a chord in geometry. Distance along the sphere is an arc, and the arc is the math we're looking for. We're interpolating not along a chord, but an arc. So, there's going to be a set angle between v0 and v1 in one dimension, so it's just a scalar. I'm going to call it omega. You'll also see theta, phi sometimes. I prefer to avoid those because I think they look too much like coordinates, which they're not. But there's no reason you couldn't use it. So we go back to our 1 minus t and our t, the two halves of that fraction. And we multiply them by this angle between the two. So we get 1 minus t omega, a function of it at least, and the same function of t omega times those 2 points. But how do we use that angle? What's the function? If you remember your original definitions of sine, cosine, and tangent, you'll remember that sine travels along basically a circle from 0 to pi, or 0 to 1 if you've normalized it by pi. I'm sorry, between 0 and 90 degrees, that's what I'm saying. At 0, sine is 0, at 90 degrees it's 1, but its slope is actually part of the definition of a perfect sphere. So we can use that here. Given that all points on the curve are linear combinations of v0 and v1, I'm not going to bother to derive that here, but it is interesting and it's very important to this. And given that sine follows a perfect circular arc, as long as you've normalized it, why not sine 1 minus t times omega and sine t omega? That'll give us the arc we're looking for. The only problem is it's not normalized now. It's not maintaining a constant distance from the radius. So if we divide that by the maximum, which is sine of omega, then it is. Now we have our actual formula for spherical linear interpolation. Going over this slowly, you can find omega as the arc cosine of the dot product between v0 and v1. So do that first and get that number and hang on to it. Throw it in a variable or something. After that, the sine of the quantity of 1 minus t times omega, that first half of that omega arc, run through sine multiplied by v0 plus the sine of the other half of omega times v1, all divided by sine of omega, so you have your distances right, is going to give you the point along a sphere between v0 and v1. If you interpolate along this equation between v0 and v1 with t being what increments, you will have a perfect arc. The reason for that is it is ultimately following the formula of the sphere, what describes its surface. So by interpolating along slurp instead of lerp, while linearly varying t, there's no reason we have to change t, that would just change the speed of the interpolation. We get a smooth spherical motion, like you saw in my demo program. So that summarizes how it works effectively. And I already showed you the program in the intro. Let's go into how we build it. That'll be happening in the next video. And I will talk to you then. If you like these, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel if you would. It helps me out a lot to know that I'm reaching more people with this stuff, and I like simplifying more advanced mathematical concepts for people who have found themselves in the unpleasant position of having to assume that it works by magic. I kill magic all the time. It's what I do, guys. So, like and subscribe if you would. In any case, I hope this helps you, and I will see you in the next lecture.